Thank you for listening to Geopolitics and Business with me, Thomas Ramge.
And Björn Konrad.
What will international AI governance look like? How far might global tech fragmentation go? And what are the most pressing topics in cybersecurity in the realm of geopolitics? Those are our three guiding questions today, which we will discuss with Niklas Batz. Nick is the Director of Cybersecurity and AI Policy of Microsoft, and he's also the co-author of an acclaimed book, Tech Cold War. Obviously, in his role at Microsoft, Nick works at the very front lines of technology, geopolitics, and business. Plus, he's has a truly global perspective. I don't. It's hard to exaggerate it here. Nick is a Danish national. His father is from New Zealand. He's married to an American wife. Nick has studied and lived in China, and he's been working and living back and forth on both sides of the Atlantic. Thank you very much, Nick, for being with us today.
Thanks, Thomas. Thanks, Björn. I'm excited.
Well, you being as international as you are, the EU and the US have obviously very different approaches to AI regulation to kick off. Can you give us a short overview? How does it look from your perspective?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So for me, as a European working for an American tech company and sounding quite American, I often get this question in terms of sharing perspectives. And obviously at Microsoft in part of my role, but also broadly as a company, we deal with this across the board, right? So just a super quick global roadshow across the world on AI policy. I think the thing that unites all regulations across geos is essentially everyone recognizes AI is important. AI is going to be transformational, but also that there are risks to AI that we need to get right. So US have taken very heavy innovation approach, focus on a lot of voluntary commitments. The previous Biden administration had a bit more of a framework perspective, and the current Trump administration is focused really on sort of innovation, allowing tech companies to grow and thrive, which is great. But in the US, even there's also a split between what happens at the federal level and what happens at the state level. And so you're seeing in the US even debates where whether there should be a federal requirement, there can't be any state legislation on AI. And I think in US in general, we're seeing a bit more of a hands-off approach, not to say that AI is not important, but really sort of focus on letting private companies, AI labs drive it. In the EU, I think in extension of how we've approached privacy legislation and regulation in general in the digital space, a bit more focus on establishing requirements. We've seen that with the EU AI Act. We've seen that with the EU General Purpose AI Code of Practice. And I think overall, my takeaway have been with EU is it's a more regulatory, defining the guardrails specifically approach compared to the US, or maybe in contrast to the US. And then in the middle of those two are the UK that seeks this pro-innovation approach. There are specific regulations and requirements, particularly related to safety and security of AI systems, but also very much a drive towards enabling private companies, enabling AI innovation across the space. And then you have other countries like Korea and Japan that are beginning to drive this, Latin America that are beginning to drive this. And then I think, interestingly, also China, which has taken a very state-driven approach, obviously building on state-driven privacy, security legislation, and continuing to do that in the AI space. So that's your whirlwind tour of AI regulation. US, more open, innovation-driven. EU, more focused on regulating risk. UK in between, and China taking sort of state-centric approach.
John.
So perhaps I add some more flavor on the China story, because I think one of the most interesting parts here is that China is really how China spins its narrative towards the globe, basically a kind of global governance of AI, and kind of tries to emphasize really kind of making it as much different, as much a counterpoint to what the US is doing, I think, looking at global AI governance, right? So where the US says competition, China says cooperation, where the US says global dominance, China says global development, right? And kind of don't get me wrong, I don't think that China is less competitive about AI and less national driven about AI than the US is, but they are spinning it exactly in the opposite way, right? So they very obviously also have a different audience that they are catering to, right? They're obviously talking to the global South here, right? And really using AI also as a topic, as a really excellent topic for global alliance building, for strategic alliance building, but also kind of smart market move by kind of paving the way for a Chinese AI tech stack in the global South, opening markets for its own companies, right? So it's geostrategic, also smart business, right? So I think that's a major point, I think, in this whole debate.
Nick, what does that fragmentation of regulation spheres means for one of the most global companies like yours, who is also one of the companies that is driving AI very successful all over the world?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's certainly something that we're sort of really focused on around governance and something we're pushing. I would say not just for AI. We've seen the same thing happening with privacy. We've seen the same thing happening with data localization rules. We've seen the same thing happen with cybersecurity. Essentially, this divergent or fragmentation, if you will, of regulations. Right. Every country, every regulatory market would like to regulate. We support that and we abide by it in the markets that we operate in. I think the challenge for us is the more harmonized those rules can be, the more they can refer to best practices, existing technical standards, the better and the easier. For Microsoft, I wouldn't say it's easy, but we have the resources to support it. Where it becomes challenging is if you're a small startup and you operate globally, it becomes a heavy compliance burden to do. So the more we can streamline regulations, certainly the better.
Right. So it's a cost factor also, right? It makes it obviously more costly to design products in that kind of a fragmented context.
Yeah, and if you think about it just from an AI perspective or just from a consumer perspective, right? If you're a business operating in Singapore and in France and in Latin America and in US, you use AI models that are trained on data sets from all over the world that have been trained on supercompute clusters that may be in various parts of the world, is supported by a cloud that's focused in your geolocation, depending on where you are and operate. You want it to be as close as possible. Sure. That's abiding to your local context and maybe also has to abide by specific local data regulation. That means the data can only sit within your environment or within your country or hosted within your country, right? So all these companies are operating in the global space. We, Microsoft, do our best to enable that. The more fragmented it becomes, the more challenging, yes, it becomes for us, but the more challenging also becomes for sort of the end customer that's just trying to make AI, for example, to drive a more efficient business.
Isn't European AI sovereignty just a pipe dream? I mean, us being so good and talking about AI ethics and sovereignty and so forth, but I mean, being honest about it, in many technical aspects, just being technical laggards.
I mean, I think also it really depends on how you define sovereignty, right? And this is sort of my first question to anyone that speaks about sovereign AI or sovereign tech stack in any form, really, sort of what's meant by that. If it's a full stack end-to-end sovereignty, meaning that anything from your hardware layer or maybe even the energy that supports the compute required to train a language model through the data sets, through the cloud that it's hosted on, through the platforms that it's delivered on, through to the languages that it's done in. I think that is really difficult to achieve anywhere, even in the US and in China. That's sort of what I would consider two sort of anchor stacks around the world. Having an end-to-end full sovereignty, never touch anywhere outside of your borders stack is really difficult to achieve. But I do think there is a drive to have more resilience or more quote unquote control over parts of the stack. For me, I think the key part is really sort of strategic interdependence. This is how we've been based in other technology platforms that don't relate to AI at all. This is how we've started way before we had anything that related to digital technology. Trade has always been essentially negotiation of strategic interdependence between countries. Different countries have different technologies. They rely on each other. They trade one thing for another. You trade gold for silk. You trade silk for food. You trade food for rare minerals or fur or whatever it might be. This is sort of not necessarily net new. Yeah. And so, for me, that's sort of really it. I do think the challenge is it is becoming politically more popular to say that. And I think it is important for people to just challenge what is meant by it, because there is a risk tied to it. There is a risk tied to it in the sense that the stacks become duplicative, that we overpromise that we want to have a sovereign stack somewhere, and we begin to build it out, and it is incredibly expensive to consumers. There's a reason why, even at a supply chain level, supply chains are designed the way they are. They are designed hyper optimized globally so that we can have cheap goods coming in from wherever in the world, no matter where you live. It's the same thing for the digital stack. If we begin to duplicate it, there's a real risk that that becomes more expensive.
Do your customers realize that already? Does that play an important role in your projects?
Yeah, and again, it sort of depends on where you sit, right? When we're having these conversations, it's a lot of times with government at the moment. Most of our customers trust us. They already work with us. They work in our environment. Their requirements, whether it's heavy regulated customers or if it's large private sector customers, they already know Microsoft. They work with us. They trust us. They are not necessarily the ones driving it. I think from a public sector perspective, from a government perspective, where there's more political drive behind it, the conversation is different. But I will say, having spent time both here in London now, in Brussels, in DC, in India, in Singapore, in Asia, wherever you go, consistently, Microsoft is recognized as a trusted partner and someone that governments can engage with and get meaningful input from. And I think that sort of is our sweet spot in this fragmented landscape, is if we can be that trusted advisor, we're far ahead already.
Right. And that calculation, right, that you're just mentioning, basically weighing additional costs against kind of also the shift in demand or the shift in risk that comes with geopolitical change, right? This whole balance that calculation, that's obviously not. I mean, that's huge for you. It's especially big for the big tech companies, but it goes all the way through, right? Kind of companies that we work with, from the very biggest tech companies to the smallest machine builder, they all at the end have the same calculation to make, right? And looks very different for each one. But balancing that calculation is basically one of the big challenges of the day. And the important part, kind of the difficult part, is pretty much everyone knows at least approximately what it costs to duplicate, right? Kind of you can definitely calculate that. What is really hard to calculate is kind of what is the other side of the equation. How big is the geopolitical risk behind it, and kind of what is shifting, what is changing, what do we have to kind of calculate against it, right? So that's what companies, big and small, are doing right now, I think.
How much are companies now struggling or already struggling with interoperability? I mean, big term, everybody's talking about it. Is it as concrete yet, or how are companies handling it right now? John, you want to start possibly?
Yeah, I think it's a great question for Nick also to answer, because I'm going to be curious, because that's where it actually happens. Microsoft is actually one of the places where interoperability actually happens, for not only for yourself, but also for almost everyone else. But that's definitely one of the big drivers of kind of how the cost side of the calculation looks like. How interoperable are things going to be? Are systems going to be? Our IT systems, cloud systems, everything is going to be, because with a higher degree of interoperability, you can kind of actually avoid much of the costs of also localizing, right? But if that's not a given anymore, and I don't think it is, then things. The expensiveness of things actually goes up radically. So, Nick, curious to hear your thought about that.
I think there's a broad view, but if I can speak just to the AI view, which is the space that I maybe know the best from a customer perspective, there's just more and more desire for AI adoption. Yeah. There's more, and by AI adoption, I don't just mean people playing around with, Copilot or building a pilot or an MVP, but sort of really deeply ingraining AI in their own product roadmaps and their own product developments across the board, and leveraging AI for sort of transformational tasks across the board in the enterprise. And what that requires is a lot more distributed compute, because you need for either regulatory reasons, or simply just for cost or lag time in terms of inference for you to deliver some of these. You need compute access as close to you as possible. And we are seeing the AI space, I think there's sort of an analysis on that across the board, also getting more and more commoditized. So it's not going to be one great model providing all solutions for everyone based out of the US. It's going to be a lot more distributed. And for customers, they're going to require access to compute. They're going to require local models, or at least locally hosted, delivered models tuned to their specific context, their specific business, their specific use case. And so that sort of drives that diffusion of AI across the board. And I think the interesting thing from a geopolitical perspective is, from an American view, and from what you're hearing in the White House, what you're seeing in the national security strategy, what you're seeing in the White House AI action plan, is there's a recognition of the value of that, how important technology diffusion can be for national security. If your tech is the default solution, It matters for soft power, it matters for hard power. And I think there's growing concern. This happened with previous technology solutions around telecoms, for example, and 5G, about adversarial tech diffusion. What happens if everyone is reliant on Chinese tech as opposed to American tech? And so I think this diffusion is certainly is more commercial trend that's happening, but underneath that, there's a lot of geopolitical interest, certainly.
Yeah, and that's exactly exactly links back to what I said in the beginning, China also kind of creating this enormously attractive narrative to especially countries in the global south, and it is working. I'm also hearing lots of voices from these countries around the globe, right? Where it's clear, okay, the Chinese tech stack on AI is obviously, because of costs and efficiency and everything, is an attractive one. It's it's not a hollow narrative. It's quite an attractive offer with strings attached, of course, and we can go into the depths of that. But overall, it sounds like an interesting proposition, right? And it does land in many places.
Especially if you claim it to be open source, and if you claim it to be trained on rather cheap chips and so forth, huh?
Yeah. And end of day, though, I would say for 99% of businesses, they don't care about geopolitics, right?
They don't have to.
If you talk to most CEOs of a business, unless they're forced to, they really don't. I mean, in the sense that they don't care, so they don't have an opinion on either or. And if you talk to businesses in India, they don't want to have to choose between a US offer or a Chinese offer. They want a local India offer. The same in Denmark, the same in France, the same in Kenya, the same in Chile. It sort of doesn't matter. And that's why I think actually the commercialization and commoditization of AI and that distributed compute that I talk about is going to drive a lot of really interesting geopolitical questions around, because the stack that can be the underwriter of that diffusion will have a lot of geopolitical leverage.
Nick,
as we've seen, for example, with semiconductors.
But Nick, let me give you some pushback here. I mean, there won't be very many competitive Danish or German or French offerings in many contexts. We're going to have to rely on the best offerings, which might come from the US or which might come even cheaper from China.
But I don't think I don't think that's necessarily a problem. I think where Microsoft has operated in those countries for a long time, we are already trusted, and so the same thing with our competitors, the same thing for other platforms. If you look at it from a security perspective, we have had the same debate in terms of both where do we get our energy from in Europe, where do we get our military and defense platforms from, and I think that conversation across the board is shifting. My push would be all of that will be expensive. And so in order for us to drive that effectively, we need to be selective on how we're spending that money. It doesn't mean that there's not an opportunity to drive more, for example, European alternatives or more local alternatives, but they're not there yet at the moment. And the better option might actually be to find across the stack. Let's bring it back to AI, for example. Europeans are a leader in clean tech. A lot of European companies are a leader in pharmaceuticals. There's a ton of applications in the application layer of the AI stack where we have exceptional talent, we have exceptional data, and we have exceptional platforms to deliver it on optimized. If we can play a role and we can have sort of that strategic interdependence with US technology platforms to deliver it, I think that will create a lot of value for both, as opposed to both sides trying to essentially duplicate the stack end to end.
I guess we'll find consent here, the three of us. Not sure if the driving forces behind the Eurostack right now would agree as much, but well, we'll see. You've mentioned the term security, which brings us to our third guiding question. And we've never talked about cybersecurity on this podcast yet. And so we're glad having you here as being a real expert in it. In the context of geopolitics, I mean, it is obvious that the cyberspace has become a real battlefield where geopolitics plays an important role. And I'm not only talking about North Korea attacking the West in order to get some ransom, but give us a short overview. To what extent have state-sponsored operations been recently a growing business risk for companies?
Yeah, it's something that we're certainly tracking. Just sort of top line data points for you guys in terms of how massive Microsoft really is in this space, right? We have about 84 trillion daily electronic signals that we get access to. We call it like the telemetry that we see come through our systems. That's a massive amount of data. That's every day. Adversely, we then defend ourselves and our customers against about 7,000 attacks, cyber attacks per second. And so there's like the challenge is massive. Microsoft is at the center of it, and unfortunately, a lot of the drivers are what we call threat actors. So Microsoft tracks about 1,500 of those. The majority of them are state-sponsored, state-supported threat actors. Some are organized cybercriminal organizations. Some are sophisticated individual cybercriminals. Across the board, they are motivated by a number of different things. For the state-sponsored ones, it could be economic motivation, it could be national security motivation, sometimes espionage motivation. For the cybercriminal organizations, usually they're financially motivated. These are the organizations that will conduct some of the more sophisticated ransomware attacks around companies around the world. But we do sometimes see a bit of overlap in terms of motivation. So starting with North Korea, since you mentioned that, a lot of the state-sponsored North Korean threat actors that we track are engaged in cyber attacks, cyber espionage for geopolitical purposes in the Asia Pacific, but they also are engaged heavily in cyber fraud, for example, impersonating IT employees in order to gain income to feed that back to the North Korean regime. And we've seen a number of examples of those. Even more recently, North Korean threat actors beginning to play around with using AI to enhance their ability to do that. That's sort of one actor. Russia, unsurprisingly, huge spike in Russian cyber activity around the war and invasion in Ukraine, something Microsoft was very close to in supporting Ukraine, essentially bringing its entire digital infrastructure up on cloud to be able to defend that better. Something that we're super proud of, the work that we continue to do there. And you see a lot of Russian activity related to Ukraine still. But also beginning to see more directed cyber attacks against critical infrastructure, relevant defense industrial base in Europe, but also elsewhere in Europe. And we've seen there's been a number of public cases with Russian threat actor attributed attacks in places like Norway and Germany and Poland, in the UK and elsewhere. And so, continued state-sponsored threat. Then there's Iran, actually probably the one that has increased the most in activity and sophistication recently. Obviously, a lot of the activity are tied to Israel-Gaza conflict in Iranian Middle East, Iranian geopolitical interests in the Middle East, and then finally China. There's been a number of public examples of China. Microsoft have shared some of them publicly, where Chinese state-sponsored actors have both done attacks with intent to create either economic disruption or damage, but also more sophisticated attacks where the intent very clearly have been for espionage purposes or data collection purposes. Across the board, I will say we're unfortunately seeing a continued increase in state activity within this, and more directed at private organizations, but not just large companies like Microsoft. We've seen an increase in attacks against the education sector, universities. We've seen an increase in attacks against NGOs and media organizations, and we've seen an increase in attacks concerningly against critical infrastructure, in particular, where the obvious potential harm from that is really greatly increasing.
From a client's perspective, a company's perspective, I mean, hearing about this vast amount of threats that you've been describing, what's a coherent strategy in order to minimize the cyber risk you were talking about, Nick?
Yeah, so the really important bit is to get the basics right. We still have a number of customers who are reliant on unpatched, vulnerable open source software. We see that time and time again. Unfortunately, cyber criminals are very quick at innovating and finding loopholes, and defenders are not as quick to patch and close those. And I think that's sort of really important, getting the basics right, whether it's enabling multi-factor authentication, role-based access management, all those sort of basic cybersecurity principles is really what will get you 95% there. And then I think the upside or the benefit is with the recent developments we've seen in AI, we have begun to really see defenders leverage AI for hardening their own defenses, hardening cybersecurity, in particular in sectors where maybe cost or resources is a challenge. So take critical infrastructure, for example. Often it relies on decades-old operational technology, legacy software that has a lot of known vulnerabilities into it. We're seeing some of our customers beginning to use AI to essentially find and patch those vulnerabilities automatically. We recently sponsored, together with a number of other AI companies, AI cybersecurity challenge at DARPA, where the contestants were asked to essentially automate vulnerability finding and patching with AI, and we saw a huge uptick in being able to demonstrate that. Not only were they able to find a bunch of vulnerabilities within the competition, they actually found a number of existing zero-day vulnerabilities that's out in the wild, and were able to patch those automatically
And so there's a ton of potential for defenders to leverage AI to their benefit. Frankly, just shifting the balance. What we've seen so far is threat actors continue to really leverage tried and tested, what we call TTPs, techniques, tactics, and procedures. And so for us, we're not necessarily seeing attackers getting really sophisticated yet using AI, frankly, because the ROI of doing good old offensive cyber attacks with more traditional quote unquote tools actually still continues to have a high payoff. So if we can raise the bar, if you will, on the basics, we'll get far, and then we can continue to have defenders experiment with leverage AI for their benefit. That's really the only thing that's going to get us there, because the number of threat actors will stay more or less consistent. Unfortunately, it will remain financially attractive, and from a geopolitical national security perspective, attractive to continue to do these attacks. And so for us, it's really about empowering defenders with it.
Makes sense. So who's going to win the arms race now using AI, the attackers or the defenders? Because that's what basically you're saying, right? I mean, you can use it for attack reason, for attacks, you can use it for defense. So back in a good old arms race, aren't we?
I think the opportunity is bigger with the defenders, because to my point, the attackers are already in and they're already going at it. And so, in particular, in organizations where you may not have security teams, you may not even have a SOC, you may have little resources. You can use AI for anything from training to augmenting the security that you do have, to even sort of like fully automate vulnerability finding. Some of the projects that I'm most excited about being involved in are the ones where we, Microsoft, work with other partners, whether that's government or startups or other industry partners, to essentially see if we can find some of those vulnerabilities, get them sorted, and then make sure that we raise the bar across the board. If the attackers are having a harder time getting into the easy targets, they will move on to the more difficult ones. So if we can make it harder for them, I think everyone wins.
So Björn, is Analytics well defended?
Yes, we are.
You won't share any details here. It just makes sense. I mean, exactly.
You're not going to give the attackers anything they can work with.
No, that's me being a tech journalist for a long time. It's always been frustrating to talk with experts on cybersecurity, because they always remain on the very general level of saying, well, no details. We obviously, whenever it gets interesting, they say, we cannot talk about that. Anyways, thanks, Nick. The last question goes to you. The question that we'll ask to all our guests: what topic, what aspect of the topics we've just discussed is the most overlooked in your sense? What are too few people talking about?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I would say two things. I think first and foremost, I think people are underestimating. I really want to underline underestimating. They're underestimating the impact that AI will have. I know that there's a ton of pushback on quote unquote the AI hype. I'm in the opposite camp. I think the transformational impact that AI will have on society across the board, but particular on security, is underappreciated. And I think the upside of this is beginning to use it for a defensive purpose, and that leads me to my second point in terms of like what I think maybe is not underappreciated, but what will come. So, and I think this is where the public-private engagement is really important. Why it's really important that Microsoft leads on some of this. We established our responsible AI principles well before there was any AI regulation at all. That was us as a company leaning into what we thought was right. We've just completed the same thing on agentic autonomous AI. And so you're already hearing a lot of commercial speak about AI agents, but they really will be transformational for a couple of reasons. First, it's really important to understand having an AI agent, for example, supporting you on security means that you have someone that works 24/7, that never takes a break, doesn't need holiday, but can continue to support and augment you throughout. and can work on problems nonstop that you don't have to worry about until it flags it for you. So you have a ton of opportunity for like really boosting your defense with AI agents, but there's also a number of security challenges around it. AI agents, similar to how the internet works today, will have to speak to each other. So you're going to need US delivered AI agents be able to communicate with European AI agents, but also Chinese AI agents for commercial purposes. How do we make sure that that interaction is safe, secure, and trusted? That is a technical challenge. And then there's a more sort of commercial challenge in that. What does that mean? How can we make sure from a human perspective, a human oversight perspective, as agents will continue to evolve and become more common? How do we know when we see something in a security system that the action was taken by a human or by an agent? In particular, if you have agents that manage other agents that manage other agents, how do you track that in terms of logging the activity if it's happening 24/7, nonstop, all the time at superhuman speed? And so I think there's both challenges around it that we are working on and trying to lean into, but there's also a ton of opportunity. And like I said, I really think AI hype, we haven't seen nowhere near where we're going to get with AI. It's really going to change. It's really going to change the world even more than I think most people think and believe.
Well, the future is open. we don't know. You could be right. But yeah, obviously. So, Björn, you get your agents ready to get your business fully automated?
Oh, yes, fully automated. No, that's not the business we are in, but getting our agents ready, definitely. That's the change that all of us are facing. And either you can be afraid about it, or you can just look at it with a smile and say, yes, that's interesting world we live in, and see what you can make of it.
I have my researcher agent actually working right now. I have to write a report on something. I have it tasked with it. It knows the time that I'm done with recording this podcast, and it's been told by this time I would like to see a draft of it with the specific entity. So
Nice.
people are already making use of it. I'm already using it. I'm going to tell you guys, like in 12 months, you'd be surprised where we are from an agentic perspective. It really will be truly transformational.
So far, we've been very glad that you haven't sent your agent, but that you came yourself to our podcast. Thanks a lot,
Thanks,
Nick.
guys.
Thank you very much. Great having you.
And thanks to you, dear listeners, as always, for your time and your interest. If you like our podcast, we'd be very pleased if you could consider leaving us a review or rating in your podcast app. And please click to the subscribe button so you will not miss out on our next episodes. You can email us at podcast@geo-lytics.com. Björn and I, the two of us, will be back with a new guest in 4 weeks from now. Until then, as always, stay sane at the crossroads of geopolitics and business.